one of my favorite subjects to talk about because it has so many direct applications for those of you going into the medical field, as does a lot of anatomy, but I think in physiology, but I think this really has some special applications, is the field of immunity. Now, immunity actually is involved with several systems in the body, but primarily we think of the lymphatic system as being the primary system of immunity, but we can't ignore, the other systems such as cardiovascular, certainly our blood, circulating a lot of our white blood cells, and white blood cells being a special part of immunity. Even our skin, our integumentary system, it's really forming a major protective area from the outside. So we'll keep that in mind, but we will mostly be probably referring to the lymphatic system, which we've covered in lab. And now let's talk a little bit about the physiological and application of immunity to the body. Okay, the first thing we do when we talk about immunity is we divide it up into the two major areas of immunity, what we call non-specific defenses, which is the bigger of the two, and specific defenses, which actually involve some of our cells called lymphocytes, primarily B cells and T cells. Now, what do we mean by non-specific defenses and specific defenses? Well, what we really mean by that is that non-specific defenses are basically there to stop any invasion from any source. It doesn't really matter if it's a virus or a bacteria or a parasite. These defenses are geared to stop almost everything. And it doesn't matter which virus it is or which bacteria it is, because there's many different viruses and many different bacteria. These defenses are just designed to stop these things from invading and wreaking havoc on the body. Specific defenses, on the other hand, are very finely tuned cells that are educated in their development process to recognize one specific type of invader. Okay, so maybe there's a specific defense that has learned to recognize protein markers or glycocalyx markers that are on some sort of invader like a bacteria or a virus. So we actually develop our lymphocytes, our B cells and T cells, in a way in which they learn to recognize a specific invader. And if that invader gets in our body, then the specific defenses are alerted from some of the non-specific defenses. And we'll be talking about this process a little bit as we go through this. But this is really an amazing thing that's going on in our body all the time. Here we see the examples of the categories of our non-specific defenses. In other words, the things that basically stop anything that's not part of the body from invading or hurting the body. So the first thing that we see is our physical barriers, which, as our definition says, prevent, approach, and deny the access to pathogens. Now, here we actually see a cross-section of a skin section. If you'll notice, we have the epithelial layer, then we would have the connective tissue under it. We see a hair sticking through, we even see sweat glands, and then we see the body secretions. So all these are basically designed to keep things like bacteria or viruses from just easily invading the internal parts of our body. So physical barriers would be things that help us to protect the internal portions of our body. So our membranes, this being an example of the cutaneous membrane, but our other membranes would do the same thing. Our body secretions would do the same thing. Things like stomach acid, even our tears, or in this case, sweat secretions. All these would be physical things that would block or slow down or inhibit the entrance of things into our inner structures, especially into our bloodstream or internal organ areas. Okay, now the next area we see are our phagocytic cells. Now, our phagocytic cells are actually types of white blood cells that do certain jobs. And the job they do is they engulf things, and that's what phagocytosis means. It means engulfing. So if you'll look up there, actually our most numerous white blood cell is called a neutrophil. And neutrophils are often called macrophages, small eaters. And so the neutrophils make up 50 to 70% of our white blood cells. And so if there's a virus or bacteria that gets in, these will try to engulf it and destroy it. Matter of fact, if you ever have a wound that forms pus, the pus is actually dead neutrophils and whatever was invading the body that it killed in the battle to protect your body. Next, we have eosinophils. Eosinophils are kind of specialists. We tend to see them under two primary conditions, either from the invasion of a parasite, some sort of parasite, and in third world countries that seems to be more prominent. In more industrial countries where we have less parasites, and we actually tend to see a buildup in the fact that we see them when we have allergies or allergens that are in our body. Now, what is it that parasites and allergens have in common? Well, the primary thing is they're both very large compared to other invaders, so our body really doesn't know the difference between a parasite or an allergen, something large. It just knows there's something large in our body, so we need to develop a defense against it. So one of the defenses against it are cells called eosinophils. They make a fairly low percentage of our white blood cells, but we do see a buildup of those. So if we were to take a blood test and check the number of white blood cells in it, if you found somebody with a lot of eosinophils, you could either probably predict that they probably got a parasitic infection or an allergen. Now, the next cell is called a monocyte. I like to call this cell Clark Kent, because as we all know, Clark Kent was the mild-mannered reporter, but he turned into Superman. So what monocytes do, they actually hang out with neutrophils. They follow neutrophils through the blood, but if there's an infection, they actually leave the blood and they become macrophages. Now we see something called free macrophages and fixed macrophages. And free macrophages are called free because they have the ability to move around. Fixed macrophages tend to be macrophages that are inhabitants of a specific tissue. So monocytes become free macrophages, and then they actually engulf, and macro means large, so they engulf whatever happens to be invading an area, and they can actually individually engulf a lot more than the neutrophils can, but we tend to have a lot more neutrophils than macrophages. So together, them working together, they tend to do a lot of damage. Now, macrophages also become part of the what's called antigen-presenting cells. They actually, once they engulf something, then they go activate the specific defenses we just talked about just a minute or two ago. And the specific defenses are geared to attack one invader. So once this has engulfed and kind of displayed on its surface what it engulfed, it goes to look for that lymphocyte that would recognize the thing that it engulfed, so that it can then clone into an army and kill whatever's invaded the body. We'll be talking more about that when we get to the section on specific defenses. All right, so here are our white blood cells that are phagocytic. In other words, they engulf the invaders. Next, we have something called immunological surveillance, which is actually performed by something called a natural killer cell. Now, a natural killer cell is actually a lymphocyte. Most lymphocytes form what we call B and T cells, and there are many categories of what we call B cells and T cells, and we'll talk about those later. But they are specific defenses. This is our exception. This is a lymphocyte that is a non-specific defense, but it performs a very important job. It does this role called immunological surveillance, where it basically patrols our own body cells, and if it finds something abnormal about that cell, for instance, that cell should be displaying normal proteins but it's not, then this cell will actually release chemicals across that will cause the unnatural cell, the sick cell, to die, hopefully killing the cell and whatever had invaded it so it can't spread to other cells efficiently. So a lot of times if a cell becomes cancerous, the natural killer cell will be able to detect that, and it will be able to kill the infected cell, the abnormal cell. Okay, our next category are called interferons, which are chemicals, and the chemicals are released by different things. They're released by lymphocytes, of course that's our B and T cells that are specific defenses. It's released by macrophages, we see our macrophages here, but mostly we think of it as being released by virus-infected cells. So if a cell gets a virus in it, then it tends to make interferons, and what the interferons do, they go to the cells around it and they protect the cells around it from the virus that infected the cell. We'll talk about how that occurs, how that process occurs in a slide that will come up here in the near future. Okay, so the one thing about interferons is interferons are only useful against viruses. They really don't help against bacteria or parasites or other things like that, but they do help against a variety or the majority of viruses. So anyway, this is one way that our cells, if a cell gets infected, it's too late for that cell. We'll release interferons to protect the cells around it that may not be infected. Okay, we actually have, by the way, interferons are proteins. We actually have another protein, whereas interferons basically help us primarily against viruses. This protein called complements helps us against both viruses and bacteria. And we see a bacterium here in this picture. And so these complement proteins are actually plasma proteins, proteins found in our blood that they either can work with antibodies or they can work with something called the lectin pathway or there are actually 3 pathways we'll talk about. So I'll show you that on a different page. But bottom line is what they do is they attach to the bacteria and they either attract other things to the area to kill it, or they form little pores in it called membrane attack complexes. And in this picture, then these proteins have formed membrane attack complexes, which have caused the cell to basically lyse. Just like that is lyse, this is lysed also by perforating the surface and allowing the extracellular fluid to flow into it and burst it. Okay, so the complements also, besides attracting other things, bursting it, they also stimulate the next response called this inflammatory response. So when it says stimulates inflammation, then that's one of the things that actually causes us to go through the inflammatory response. Now, the inflammatory response is often misunderstood. It has multiple effects. Often we think the inflammatory response is the sickness. Really, the inflammatory response is the symptoms of the body responding against the invader. It's just that we feel the effects, so we think that is the sickness itself. So there are different things that trigger the inflammatory response. We have some tissue cells, some white blood cells called basophils, or tissue cells called mast cells. As we saw here, these complement proteins, there are many different things that actually will release chemicals that trigger, in this case, there's a tissue cell called a mast cell that triggers these responses, and we'll look at see what's actually happening again in the very near future. But it really, most of it boils down to increasing blood flow to the area of the infection. Now, why would we want to increase blood flow to an area of infection? Well, one thing, we're delivering all the healing elements. We're delivering these white blood cells that we talked about here. We may even be delivering some of the complement proteins there, because complement proteins are blood proteins. We may get some of the interferons there through the blood. Okay, so another thing that happens is we do activate our phagocytes that's within our blood once the inflammatory response is started. The permeability, or the ability for things to move between our capillaries to get out of the blood into the tissue area is increased. That's super important. And again, we activate our complements, which have helped stimulate this, but are also going to attract things to the infection and also help lyse the infection, the bacteria or the cells that would be there. And we also clot off the area to try to keep the infection contained in one area. We get a regional temperature increase, which is different from a fever. Fever is your overall body. Regional temperature increase is what's going on in the immediate area. And of course, anytime you increase temperature, you increase metabolism, you speed up the process, in other words. And then this also helps activate those lymphocytes, the T cells and B cells that will clone into an army and come to the area and kill whatever the infection is. So we're going to talk more about this, but it's really mostly based on increased blood flow to an area. Okay, last but not least is fever, and we all get a fever at times. And actually, this is a systemic. In other words, it's affecting our whole body. It speeds up our metabolism to cause everything that we've talked about to occur at a faster rate. And it also inhibits some of the pathogens from being able to live or reproduce.